Hey, it's Evelyn, and thank you for being here with me on Reppin. I'm coming to you from New York City at the Tribeca Film Festival, where I just saw a documentary that caught my attention in the best way, and I knew I had to bring it to you. It's called We Are Pat. At first I thought, wait, a documentary about Pat? You know, that quirky, androgynous Saturday Night Live character from the 1990s, played by Julia Sweeney. Curly hair, thick glasses, Western shirt and khakis, and the whole joke was that no one could figure out if Pat was a man or a woman. It sounded super niche, and that's exactly why I had to check it out. But this film, it's so much more. We Are Pat uses Pat as a lens to unpack how we view gender, how comedy has shaped those views, and what it means when your only form of representation is the punchline. It's a thoughtful look at identity, culture, and the power of reclaiming stories that reduced us to stereotypes. And at the heart of all of it is the filmmaker's own personal journey. This project is rooted in their childhood connection to Pat, a mix of fascination, discomfort, and identity discovery, making the film as intimate as it is cultural. I can't wait for you to listen into this conversation, so please meet the director of We Are Pat, Rowan Haber. How are you, and congratulations on being at Tribeca.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm doing great. Excited for the film. It's premiering tomorrow. So,
how are you feeling? I mean, it's big.
Yeah, I feel good. I've never been in one of my own films, so that's a new experience for me. But I'm excited to see it with a full audience and just kind of see how people react to it.
It is a fantastic film. We Are Pat, which is the name of the documentary. When I first saw it, I was like, okay, it's a documentary about the iconic SNL character, Pat, which the whole quote unquote joke was people didn't know if Pat was a man or a woman. And it was a phenomenon back in the 90s. But what was the genesis of it to make this documentary for you?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I was obsessed with Pat. And my middle school friend and I would sort of just watch Pat all the time. And there was something about Pat that just stuck in my mind. And looking back on it, maybe it was that Pat was sort of kind of gleefully evading anybody's sort of questions and critique of them. Also that Pat was just, I don't know, there were a lot of sort of funny slapstick jokes that to a kid were really funny, you know?
Right.
And so Pat just sort of stuck in my mind, and I forgot about them for approximately 30 years. And then 25 years. And then I was at a Sundance dinner at this funny steakhouse in Burbank, and I was eating like a wedge salad or something. And we were talking about, you know, misguided 90s movies that should never be remade, you know, like Gremlin, Cocoon, you know, all this stuff. And I just suddenly blurted out, like, I want to remake It's Pat. And I honestly had not thought about Pat in 25 years. I don't even know where that came from, but obviously Pat had been sort of simmering in my mind for all those years. And so I went back and rewatched film with my childhood friend that I originally saw it with, and just still laughed so hard. I thought it was hilarious again, all over again. I was like, oh my God, this is still funny to me. I mean, the humor, some of the humor is like a little silly, but
still funny though.
Still funny to me. But I also had this other feeling, which was just like this, you know, uncomfortable feeling of watching something that was sort of meant to laugh at me. You know, at the time I identified as non-binary. Now I identify more as trans-masc, but whatever. You know, it's on a spectrum. And at the time I was just getting all these questions. Kind of just, I was being treated like a Pat. I'd go in one bathroom, and if I went in the women's room, women would sort of freak out sometimes. And then I didn't really feel comfortable being in the men's room because I was like, oh, there's like pee all over and it's gross in here, you know? It's like, women's rooms are obviously better, let's be honest, in terms of hygiene. So
that's a whole nother podcast, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just kind of, I don't know, I think it just hit a different chord, and I was like, oh, wow, this is really weirdly both lightly offensive to trans and gender nonconforming people, but it's also really accurately reflecting my experience of the world. So I was like, how does this piece of art both lampoon something that I am, but also really accurately reflect it? And so many years before non-binary was even a named identity. Obviously, there have always been gender non-conforming people, trans people, but we just had different language in the 90s. So yeah, it really started that way. I think that question of like, how can I laugh at something that's meant to laugh at me was like the genesis. Then it kind of developed into questions of like, is Pat reclaimable? And, you know, like, what is trans comedy now? And that was something that we eventually came to.
Like I said, this movie is so dynamic and it is so layered. In many ways, this film is so universal because it asks many questions of many people. It's about gender. It's about identity, personal identity, regardless of whether you're straight, gay, bi, non-binary, LGBTQIA. If you're a human being that's breathing, it basically asks the same question of identity. Now, I need to ask you this. You hit on so many things. And again, Rowan, there's so many, like my brain is blowing up when I was watching the film. As an Asian person, I didn't see anyone that looked like me on TV. And when I did see the rare one, it was sort of this offensive caricature. And the joke was me, the Asian, right?
Yeah.
So it really even stung when you said that the Pat skit was laughing at you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That hurt me just listening to it. And I don't want to over-identify.
Yeah.
But in some ways I can sort of identify because Asians were the butt of the joke as well. So when you were 10 and you watched something that is, you haven't really necessarily figured it out yet. Maybe you did at 10, I don't know. But certainly there wasn't language to it at that point in the 90s. And you're seeing somebody that you can kind of identify with, but you knew that you were the joke. What did that, but that was your only sense of representation too at that point, right? So how did that inform you? What kind of information did it give you? And how did it hit you as a 10-year-old when you haven't even figured out who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great question. And just to sort of speak to what you mentioned, the 90s, you know, and we don't entirely have time to get into it in the movie, but the 90s was a time where it was like horribly racist and homophobic and transphobic and ableist. Like all of these tropes were being thrown around really loosely in comedy, in the general media. When I was looking back at the SNL episodes of the 90s, Pat was not the most offensive one. You know, there's far more offensive things than Pat. Like Pat is, you know, really not that bad in comparison to a lot of things. And I am sorry to hear that you identify with that experience, but it also, I think, is, you know, nice to be able to talk about that experience of feeling like laughed at. But I think as a 10-year-old, I did not know that I was trans. I didn't, you know that I was queer, really. I think I was just like a little kid in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up. But I do think that Pat really, you know, subconsciously was a cautionary tale of, if you are this thing, then this is the treatment that you will receive in society. If you are like gender non-conforming and chubby and dorky and you have glasses and you're awkward, like that you will just sort of be something that people look at and are always only see you for those attributes and are always trying to not understand who you are as a person, but just like question this one thing about you. And this idea of sort of being illegible to society is something that is really painful because it sort of just messes up your daily life. If you're just walking around and you're going to the store or you're going to go use a bathroom, like these are just really basic things. And so when trans folks like have to go through these things where they're sort of constantly being misgendered or kind of like people are awkward around us, it is uncomfortable. You know, it's just uncomfortable in the way that anyone who is othered experiences discomfort when people act weird around you. It's not like a fun feeling. So I think maybe it was a bit of a cautionary tale. But I do want to say that for other people, I mean, Pat is so interesting because like Pat was a cautionary tale, right? But for other people, Pat was also a source of identification.
Right.
Like J.D. Sampson in the film says, you know, that she really identified with Pat like as a kid and was reading Pat's positive attributes, like Pat's sort of invulnerability, Pat's invincibility. the ways where Pat, in a way, like in terms of a power dynamic, was like always in control in the room because all the attention was always on Pat.
Right.
And Pat always came out on top because they never did reveal their gender,
right.
Which actually is kind of radical that Julia never revealed Pat's gender. She was just like, nope, not going to do it. Again, it's so interesting to have this figure that's like problematic on one hand, but radical, really radical and positive on the other hand. And so I think that's what I was trying to look at.
You definitely did. I think the other thing to that, I mean, there's so many contradictions even with that character, Pat, because in one part of the film, you and your production team, who, by the way, were all so good in terms of how funny they were and how much perspective they shared. I think what was interesting is, I think one of your production teammates pointed out, in one hand, Pat was sort of the only representation at that point of non-binary or trans at that particular point. There was no language for it. But then the portrayal was quote unquote clownish almost, because it was like very awkward. It was very like, there were things going on with the hands and the crazy hair and the, you know, the khakis, which I don't think khakis should ever come back. But that's a
you
whole.
heard it here first, you guys.
And I'm not a fashionista, honey, but I don't think khakis should come back. So on one hand, it was like either super clownish and completely exaggerated to, you know, the super hot androgyny of the 90s of the fashion, right? And there was like nothing in between. There was like nothing in between. So when you're 10, do you remember a moment where you're kind of like, okay, I identify with Pat, but not really? And does this mean that this is how the world sees me?
I didn't really think of it that way then. I think I was like too busy trying to be a girl, you know, for the most part. Like, I think, you know, it's like, or just, you know, because I think when you're younger, you're just sort of, well, I don't know. People have different experiences, right? Like my experience of gender is not, you know, every trans person's experience, but I didn't really have like inklings about my gender until like a little bit later on. But I do think that, you know, Pat certainly delivered like a strong message about gender. Someone asked me recently, like, do you remember any other sort of iconography from the 90s that really struck you from your childhood? And I was thinking about like The Princess Bride and how, you know, the princess had that little pearl thing on her head. And she was just like this impossible femininity, like white, blonde, blue-eyed femininity that was like literally perfect. So I remember being a kid and being like, well, I can never be that. It just felt femininity felt so impossible and so hard to fit into like in the right way. So I do think that there was like a lot of gendered things that were sort of like guiding me in one direction or the other.
So this brings me, and by the way, going back to what you said, like Pat was always in a position of power. That is actually very true, because not only did Pat never reveal their gender, Pat was also very comfortable with who Pat was.
Totally.
And I think that was a really key point that you put out in the film. I think that was such a great message to take away from your film and also from the character. Now that I see this character in a whole new light, is just be happy and comfortable with who you are and like love it. Who cares what anybody else says? One thread that you touched on in the film, which was people who can't seem to label or identify something clearly, it triggers like microaggressions. Can you talk about one experience that you had and something that somebody said in the film that helped you sort of crystallize or clear up maybe something that you felt when you were a kid?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of that. Like, something that I'll say about this film was that it was so joyful to make. You know, just be honest out with so many trans people and have us talk really frankly about these things in a really candid way was so beautiful. That's like a huge testament to my crew and my team and all the people that I hired and my cinematographer who's amazing and just everybody that we created this comfortable environment. But one of the things that stuck with me was Nico Carney, who's one of the younger comics of the group, said he talks about how he looks back on his childhood and these like moments of transness sort of like shined through. He'll look at sort of his baby pictures and be like, oh, that's who I am now. And I think that happens with a lot of trans people where it's like we look back at our baby photos and we're like, oh, we were already who we were. But then, of course, you like go through puberty and then you're like, who am I? And puberty is awkward for everyone. And then somehow it's like a return to your childhood to a certain extent. For example, why I put my kid photo in there, because I look like a lot of different things in my life. Like I wasn't always just this like androgynous, creature, but when I was a kid, like I just loved that photo because I was so awkward and I'm in the shower wearing these weird Mickey Mouse glasses and I kind of look like Pat. So there's like a cute juxtaposition there. And I think that thing that Nico said of like the idea of like going back to things from your childhood that you loved and sort of reframing them and reclaiming them as a way to heal that moment in your life to a certain extent is a little bit what this film kind of did. Shadi Pataski also says it. She says, because so many things in our childhood, to your point, like did not represent us, to go back and look at something that sort of represented us, but did so in a problematic way and then reclaim and reframe it is a way of reclaiming power over that moment.
Do you remember that turning point that you were like, oh, I'm reclaiming it?
There wasn't really one moment. I think with me, everything is a bit of a slow burn. And I think we made the film over 5 years. So what's interesting is that I never intended to be in the film. And
really?
And yeah, I never was going to be in the film. I have no desire to be in front of camera. Like it's not.
I get that.
It's not where I want to be.
But you were such a driving force. Like you were very much the heartbeat of this film, because in some ways it was a biography and exploration, both cultural, society, your personal. It was just so much going on with every single scene. So I loved that you were offering so much in this film all the way through. From so many different perspectives. When you started this film, it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And you were like, okay, I'm going to make a documentary of Pat. Mm-hmm. Did you realize the impact that it would have on your own experiences from the time you were like 10 and going, oh, I understand this character, but I'm being laughed at. This is how I'm going to be treated. So I'm seeing it in phases. When you were 10, to when you first started this documentary. Can you talk about sort of charting those progressions in terms of the impact that you had?
When I started the film, it was very early on in my own transition. And I think that was kind of a moment where the film acted as a way for me to chat about like different experiences that I was having with other trans people to a certain extent. I started this film developing it during the pandemic. And so we were so isolated. And I really I was really craving community and humor, quite frankly, because everything was so bleak. So I think that the film, certainly had an impact on me in terms of just kind of allowing me to air my own thoughts and get other people's thoughts around transness and around, our own experiences. And even as we made the film, the politics radically changed around transness. It started a little bit more, I guess we started in the Trump administration and then we went through the Biden administration back to Trump. And so, it certainly, when we started the film, was less intense than it is now in terms of the sort of political backlash that we're getting. It also was just a nice kind of thing to return to as all of this horrible shit was happening, basically. To get to like see the humor and to get to go out to shows and connect with all these comics, like it really was super meaningful for me. And I think it really just had me interrogate like my own trajectory and my own, and look back at my childhood. And it was like free therapy, not free because the film had a budget, but
that was a very, very expensive session for 5 years.
The most expensive therapy ever for me and Julia. It's just me and Julia in therapy.
But you know what? Look where therapy got you. I mean, you're in Tribeca. I don't understand, and this is my own personal question, why there's such a need for the world to clearly label things. And the minute you don't necessarily sit neatly in this box, people kind of short circuit a little bit.
Yes.
And I think this film certainly touches on that because Pat doesn't fit. LGBTQIA, quote unquote, doesn't fit. Mm-hmm. How has making this film, which I didn't know that it sort of coincided with your own transition, allow you to see those boxes and allow you to step out of it comfortably? Or is that something you're still struggling with?
Yeah, I think, let's see.
So I think that's two questions, because it's like one thing you have to reckon with by yourself, to be like, I'm just going to be me and not have to quote unquote conform or to appease the world's perspective of me or expectations. Yeah. But then the second thing is, it's still society that's like coming at you that you need to deal with, right? So there's two things that you have to somehow reconcile. Did making this film help you kind of give you the strength to step out of it, or is that still something you're grappling with?
I guess I should clarify. I started medically transitioning sort of in the beginning of the process of the film. I had already identified as non-binary for like 7 years and had not medically transitioned. So I think I was really identifying as non-binary. I think I was really comfortable with sort of, or not comfortable because it's uncomfortable, but I was like comfortably uncomfortable with not being in a box, But I do think that making the film, it really kind of fortified me to have conversations with other trans people while I was medically transitioning, and, allowed me to feel comfortable to inhabit whatever gender. There's this old narrative around transness, which is true for some people and not for others, but like this idea of like being born in the wrong body, and you go from point A to point B, kind of like man to woman or woman to man, or, and then of course non-binariness entered the conversation. But the thing is, we are all at all times changing. Certainly when you're medically transitioning, you're changing faster, but like there's this sort of misconception that trans people aren't the only ones who are always changing. Like cis people are always changing. We're all always grappling with like aging and hormonal shifts and changes in our lives. And the film certainly just happened at an opportune time for me while I was going through this sort of period of growth. It expanded my trans community, and I mean, I already had trans community, but it's like it expanded it into the comedy world, which, let me tell you, is a really fun community to have because comics are really fun to hang out with. And it allowed me to laugh. It really like gave me humor in a moment where things are tough. It's a really hard time in the world for everybody right now. It's a really politically fraught and insanely hard time. And I think being around people who understand you and who can make you laugh is like the most supreme thing.
Yeah, I would die to be a fly on the wall in the writer's room with comics, because it's like those one-liners. It's like, HR cannot be in the room, but that's like the best stuff ever.
Nope.
Stuff ever that will make you laugh so hard. Going back to what you were saying in terms of the current world climate, which is very complicated and certainly frightening on many levels, and I think for everyone, I'm just going to say for everyone, but certainly the LGBTQIA community is certainly under attack. What made me really sad also is a lot of the things that you pointed out in the film. Back in the 90s, one of the questions was the skit and character is still pertinent and relevant. How did it age? And then you pointed out like some of the sketches back in the 90s of Pat walking into a room of very cisgendered, conservative white men. And Pat was, again, the butt of the joke under complete scrutiny. And it made me kind of sad because that was the 90s. I'm not sure things have changed that much. You being in the community and then also the helm of this film, We Are Pat, this documentary, how does that hit you? And what is the conversations that you want to start or you want people to have with this film?
Yes, I think, I live I live in Los Angeles. So my experience, and I'm a filmmaker, so my experience of transness is a very curated one to a certain extent. I live in a liberal community. I don't have to be around a lot of extremely transphobic people or really conservative people, but that's not a lot of people's experience. A lot of people, don't have those choices and don't have that privilege. It is a really scary time to be a trans person, specifically depending on the nexus of your identity. A trans person of color, trans woman of color is having a much scarier time than I'm having in this climate, and that's always been the case. With this film, the kind of points that I really wanted to make were a few points. So one is just that we can have these conversations, right? I hope that cis people feel that they can watch this film and that they are invited to the party. this film is for everyone. It's not just about trans people for trans people. Certainly, I want trans people to like it and enjoy it, but it's kind of like looking at these bigger questions of like, how does art age? What is the creator's responsibility to their work? How do we look at comedy? Like, what is it okay to laugh at? What is the role of perspective in comedy?
Right.
You know, is it okay to laugh at problematic favorites? We're all grappling with these sort of like cultural relics that may have aged in a way that's not so flattering. A, like looking at those bigger questions. B, when we have a problem with something or when we have a question about something, rather than immediately canceling it and dismissing it or striking it from the record, I think ideally having a conversation about it and having kind of doing actual research and talking to the creator, if you have access to that, is really wonderful. I'm hoping that what this film can show is that we can have loving and civil conversations about things that we don't necessarily agree on, and we can work through it. And that's, you know, perhaps, hopefully that's a lesson that can be expanded upon and used in things that aren't just about, you know, pop culture. We have to start figuring out how to talk to each other or how to work through this, because it is pretty terrifying. The third thing is really that with this film want to, in a way, de-exceptionalize transness. Like, transness to a certain extent is a unique experience, obviously. Like, we have a different experience than other people. On the other hand, we do a lot of things that cis people do and that we all just have in common. It's like, you know, the ways that there's this sort of really heightened rhetoric around taking hormones and having surgeries. And it's like, well, women, when they age, sometimes take estrogen. And when they age, sometimes take testosterone. You know, people get gender-affirming surgery all the time. They get breast enhancements, breast reductions. They get calf implants. They get butt implants. These are things that everybody does. It's not something that's unique to trans people. And those are all like sort of gender-affirming things. So I think by othering trans people, by being like, wow, they're so freaky and they're like taking hormones and they're doing these surgeries and hurting themselves. It's like, I mean, we're not doing that to like goths when they decide to like pierce their ears and have big gauges. Why are we questioning this bodily autonomy stuff again? Do you know what I mean? Either we give people bodily autonomy and we say, do what you want with your body, as long as you're not killing yourself, or we don't. And then we restrict everybody's bodily autonomy. But the idea of just restricting one population's bodily autonomy is disgusting, frankly. De-exceptionalizing transness is something that I also hope people take from this film.
I can tell you that if one of your goals of making this film was about sharing this with communities beyond the LGBTQIA, I told you right out of the gate, you absolutely do. As a straight Asian woman, I love this film because I think it asked a lot of very interesting questions for everyone if you're able to walk in and receive it. And you don't go in with these sort of preconceived notions and biases to the film. As a storyteller, you achieve so much that you ask questions, it's joyful, but it's also really substantive. In other words, you're not banging me over the head where I need to go to therapy and I feel like I need a drink after.
Yeah.
It's such a joyful film. Yeah, I don't need any help in that regard. I'm fine. I'm doing fine without your film. Taking care of it. In fact, you're welcome to join me. How can we continue to break those boxes? Because people do have a very strong need to identify someone. Otherwise, there is some sort of backlash. From your point of view, being in the trans community, being a filmmaker, being a storyteller, how can we continue to break those boxes down?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question that we all struggle with because to a certain extent, we are also in a time where we self-identify, right? And there are so many labels. And even as someone who is not of the youngest generation of queer and trans people, I struggle with that sometimes because there are so many different sort of designations that people identify as now. And so to a certain extent, you're like, oh my God, there's so much like, and I understand, especially for cis people, there's this thing of like, I don't want to get someone's pronouns wrong. Like, oh no. And certainly it is, you know, it is uncomfortable when someone gets your pronouns wrong. But I think that most people would agree with me. If someone tries to get your pronouns right, or they just sort of like ask you, that's really nice. It's really great. at the core of it, it's like not being afraid of other people to a certain extent, not being afraid of other people's difference, which is hard because I think a lot of the time the fear really comes from like, I don't want to upset them. I don't want to get this wrong. I don't want to hurt somebody, and I think that can apply to people across lots of different types of differences. It's like anything else, like taking in more content. I mean, we can't always look to media for answers, right? With any identity, you read something by like, Ocean Vuong, and you're like, oh my God, like this is a incredible, beautiful gay man who was raised in like a rural area, who has this experience of being an immigrant. And like, maybe I don't know anything about that, but it's so specific and so good that you relate to the emotionality of it. It's just like taking in art like that, where you're just relating on a really human level. Because at the end of the day, like we're all literally just humans on this earth, like trying to make it work.
So you also got the one and the only Julia Sweeney on.
Yes, I did.
Who actually was the creator and the actor who embodied Pat.
Yes.
And she said a lot of things that when she first did the character, she wasn't thinking too deeply about all of the subtext that it actually presented for you, which I think is fair,
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and it's a lack of perspective. But when you had her on, and then you guys went on this 5-year journey of making this documentary, what do you think she learned? What kind of insight do you think can you share between some of your more personal and private moments?
Yeah, I mean, I wish Julie was here to tell you herself because she's so wonderful. It's funny, I showed her the film for the first time last week, before the premieres, because I wanted her to be able to see it before she saw it in a room full of like 500 people. And she really liked the film, and she said, wow, I wish I had seen this film before we started filming. It's like, because I think that it's like she did learn things.
It really is such a journey for all of you.
She always like had mixed feelings about Pat, because on one hand, like you create this character that's beloved and that's the sort of pinnacle of comedy, right? You're on SNL during this golden era of the 90s, and you have a character that lasts for 4 years. Like that's a lot of years, and then is spun off into like a major motion picture, a draft of which is written by Quentin Tarantino.
Is that crazy?
Yeah. A lot of people loved Pat, like Nirvana loved Pat. It just was a huge phenomenon. So to go from that to then cut to years later, like your character sort of being looked at as this relic and this sort of offensive, hateful thing, when that was never your intention, I think that she came in feeling weight around that, because she's a lovely person with feelings and with a moral compass. And I think she felt badly that Pat was considered that way. I think at the same time, she felt some defensiveness around it because that wasn't her intention. And also she had heard the tales of like how Pat helped people come out, which I think, in certain cases, Pat certainly did. So I think that she came in with this like weight. And then as we kind of went through the process, I think it was almost like a cathartic experience for both of us, where then she was able to talk about Pat a lot, because I interviewed her a bunch of times. But also, like, I think meeting the trans comics in the writer's room, I think was super cathartic to her, because she was like, okay, here's a room full of trans people. They don't all hate me,
Right.
They're really like interested in me. They, they all got along swimmingly. Julia's really charming. The comics are really charming. They all had a great time. And they were able to sort of share with each other. She was able to share her experience of being a woman in comedy in the 90s and sort of the gender pressure that she felt around that and being in a boys' club. And they were able to share how, Pat sort of scared them when they were young and made them scared about like what it would be like to be trans in the world. That was a big learning curve for her. She told me just various times that she was just so happy that this project happened, so that she could actually not feel this weight around this character, literally have her voice heard and just have a conversation around it.
That's a great journey, because it's clear that you two both went on an evolution.
Yes.
Through the making of this film. That was very clear. Which brings me to this point, and this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. As someone who has sat and logged many hours in the edit room, more than I care to remember. There is a very interesting dynamic that happens when you're in the edit room in a film or a project. which is when you're looking at footage so much and you're going through, shooting it and asking yourself questions about the story arc or the development or where you're going with this, and then you're going in the edit. Almost at every single step of production, and then certainly post-production, that content is being mirrored back and hitting you. This film is so personal to you. And honestly, and I don't say this with any iota of sarcasm, but Pat has been with you your whole life. From the time you were 10, and then, you were on a Ross and Rachel break, where you didn't think about Pat until you decided to make the film.
Yeah.
But when you're sitting in the edit room and all of this is hit, and you're thinking about it a lot, and from many different perspectives, how did that understanding of your own identity change? Was there a moment when you're sitting in the edit, you're interviewing someone, and someone says something to you that you're like, holy shit, that's it. Like, I completely get it, and I didn't have the words for it until now?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's such a good question. There's so much.
Because something happens when you're looking at this footage over and over again.
Yeah.
That it forces you to look at things that you didn't see before.
What helped me grow is sort of seeing, and this is a way with a lot of documentary, but specifically this film because of the content. But I think I'm always really humbled by people who are willing to tell me their story and be really open and frank about their lives. I think it's such a beautiful thing and huge leap of faith to let someone into your life like that. And so there were so many moments during the interviews where people shared things that felt really vulnerable, that kind of allowed me to be vulnerable as well, because I'm in the film. All the other films I've ever made, I've not been in the film. And it's much easier to be on this side of things, being having other people be vulnerable, and you just get to ask the question. That's an interesting power dynamic, right? But in this film, I had to also be vulnerable myself and be in it in order for it to actually work. We tried it the other way without me being in it, and it didn't work as well. There were so many, moments where people were sharing, just bits about their childhood. Grace Freud talks about how Pat scared her when she was little because she was, growing up intersex, and she thought, seeing Pat made her think that maybe she's freakish and maybe there's something kind of wrong with her body, and having to deal with that. And, also talking about fatness and the nexus of sort of desirability and fatness, and kind of how Pat made her have questions about that. Nori Reed, who I love, who's brilliant comic, talking about her feelings around comedy and having really deep feelings around comedy. How hard it is being trans and getting on those stages and just summoning the I can't even imagine. It's terrifying to be on stage in front of a bunch of people and then to have to try to make them laugh during this moment. Yeah. Trying to be trans on stage in this moment, making jokes. That alone, in this political moment, allowed, kind of mirrored to me how to be vulnerable. And I think that in itself was something that is a growth point for me.
Yeah, that's really hard, especially when you're so comfortable being behind the camera like we are.
Yes.
Yes. It's like being on camera. I'd rather go to the dentist without drugs. Do you know what I mean?
Correct. Yep.
So I tip my hat to you because I really think the film works so beautifully with you as a heartbeat. Sign us off, Ro. Let me know who you are and what you represent.
Yes. I'm Rowan Haber, and I represent the Pats of the world.
That's it for today's episode. I want to send a huge thank you to Rowan Haber for taking the time during the premiere at Tribeca Film Festival to join me and for sharing their honesty, heart, and creativity. We Are Pat. It's such a smart and emotionally resonant film. It dives deep into identity, culture, and representation. It's thoughtful, powerful, and even playful at times, striking that great balance that makes space for both introspection and levity. If you get a chance to see it, and please do, whether you remember Pat or you're discovering the character for the first time, this film invites us all to reflect on who we are, how we're seen, how we treat others, and how storytelling can help us heal and evolve. Thanks to Nelson Pinero, my friend, technical director, and musical composer, Find me on Instagram at Reppin_podcast. Let me know your thoughts and go to the YouTube page where you'll be able to see this and some other interviews. Yes, see them. You could see the whole interview, like on video. That's at Reppin Podcast. Check out the other guests I've had. Subscribe, share, and download, and know that I appreciate your support. Okay, y'all, thanks again. Until next time, stand up and represent.